The crystal chandelier cast a warm, flawless glow over the mahogany dining table in their Oakwood Estates home, a picture of Manhattan-adjacent perfection. Elizabeth reached for her Pinot Noir, her gaze drifting to Andrew's unlocked iPad on the marble counter, where an email preview glowed in the dim light, a Cartier receipt for a diamond pendant delivered to a Brooklyn apartment she didn't recognize. The silence of the house suddenly felt heavy, suffocating her with the quiet, devastating certainty that the man she loved was living a double life. If stories of shattered illusions and the quiet, dangerous path to reclamation speak to you, stay with me. There are deeper secrets hiding behind these manicured lawns, and if you want to see how this all unravels, don't leave the channel just yet. The rain outside their Oakwood Estates home was a soft, rhythmic drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sound that usually brought Elizabeth Ashford a deep sense of peace. Tonight, however, the heavy drops felt like a ticking clock. She stood in the master bathroom, the stark white marble cold beneath her bare feet. In her trembling hand, resting just above the rim of the porcelain sink, was a plastic wand. Two stark, unforgiving pink lines stared back at her. An unplanned pregnancy at 32. It was a variable she hadn't accounted for, a sudden detour in the meticulously plotted trajectory of her life as the VP of Ashford Media Group. Elizabeth closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. She took a slow, measured breath, forcing her racing heart to find its baseline. Andrew would be home soon. She pictured his face, the crinkles around his eyes, when he smiled the way his hand always found the small of her back at Manhattan galas. He had been asking for a child for 2 years. This was supposed to be a moment of overwhelming joy. She wrapped the test in a tissue and buried it deep inside her Dior makeup bag. She needed to process it herself before she could say the words out loud. Walking out into the expansive, dimly lit kitchen, Elizabeth poured herself a glass of sparkling water, ignoring the expensive Pinot Noir they usually shared on Friday nights. Andrew's iPad, discarded carelessly on the kitchen island from his morning reading, suddenly lit up. The screen illuminated the dark granite surface. Elizabeth didn't habitually check his devices. Trust was the bedrock of the Ashford Brooks brand. But the notification banner was large, stark, and impossible to ignore. Cartier, e-receipt order confirmed. Her brow furrowed. Their anniversary was still 4 months away. A sudden, uncharacteristic wave of curiosity, or perhaps some primal intuition, pushed her hand forward. She tapped the screen. Andrew, in his typical arrogant security, had never bothered to change his passcode from her birthday. The email opened. The item was a vintage diamond tennis bracelet. The cost was staggering enough to make even an heiress blink. But it wasn't the price tag that caused the air to completely leave Elizabeth's lungs. It was the shipping address. Delivered to Zoe Harris, 142 Montague Street apartment, 4B, Brooklyn, NY. Elizabeth stared at the name. Zoe Harris. The letters seemed to blur, swimming in her vision as a high-pitched ringing started in her ears. She scrolled further down. There was an attached note transcribed by the boutique. For the nights I can't be there. Yours, A. The house was completely silent, save for the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator and the relentless rain. Elizabeth did not scream. She did not throw the iPad against the marble backsplash. Her training, decades of being an Ashford, of managing crises and projecting absolute control, kicked in with terrifying efficiency. Her mind immediately flashed to the plastic wand hidden in her makeup bag, the child growing inside her, the immaculate life they had built in this gated community, the magazine covers, the joint bank accounts. It was all a meticulously constructed set, and the stage was collapsing beneath her feet. The sound of the garage door opening vibrated through the floorboards. Andrew was home. Elizabeth carefully locked the iPad screen, placing it exactly where she had found it, aligning the edge perfectly with the grain of the granite. She turned toward the hallway just as the mudroom door opened. Andrew stepped in, shaking the rain from his tailored overcoat, his handsome face lighting up as he saw her. God, the traffic on the FDR was a nightmare, he said, walking toward her with that familiar, easy smile. He leaned in, kissing her cheek. He smelled of rain, expensive cedarwood cologne, and something else, a faint floral scent that did not belong in their house. I'm glad you're home, Elizabeth said. Her voice was perfectly steady, smooth as glass. She looked into the eyes of the man she had promised her life, to the father of the child she secretly carried. Beneath the surface of her calm exterior, something fundamental snapped, turning cold and dark. She wasn't going to cry. She was going to take everything he had. Tuesday afternoon hung heavy over the East River, the Manhattan skyline obscured by a low gray mist. Elizabeth sat in the shadowed corner of a boutique roastery on Montague Street, a pristine trench coat belted tightly around her waist. In front of her, an untouched black espresso cooled in a ceramic mug. She kept her eyes fixed through the rain-streaked window, trained precisely on the carved mahogany doors of number 142 across the street. She had told her assistant to clear her afternoon schedule, citing a mild migraine. In truth, a different kind of ache was taking root inside her. A sudden hollow wave of nausea rolled through her stomach, a quiet biological reminder of the secret she harbored. She pressed a trembling hand against her abdomen, forcing herself to breathe evenly. At exactly 2:15, the heavy door of the brownstone pushed open. Zoe Harris stepped onto the wet pavement. She was not the polished, sharp-edged Manhattanite Elizabeth had half expected. Zoe possessed an effortless, messy kind of beauty. Loose curls, a frayed denim jacket, a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. A second later, Andrew emerged behind her. Elizabeth's breath hitched, trapping itself in her throat. He was not wearing his suit jacket, his tie loosened casually around his collar. He looked relaxed, unburdened. As they stood on the sidewalk, Andrew reached out, tracing the line of Zoe's jaw before pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. As Zoe reached up to hold his hand, the dull afternoon light caught the brilliant, icy flash of a vintage diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. Simultaneously, the phone in Elizabeth's pocket vibrated. She did not look away from the street as she slid the device out and tapped the screen. Andrew stuck in back-to-back meetings with the compliance team in Midtown. Might miss dinner. Order from that Italian place you love. Miss you. Elizabeth read the words as she watched him hail a yellow cab for Zoe in Brooklyn, leaning through the window to say one last goodbye. The duality of it was physically sickening. He was performing a life with her while living one with someone else. She locked her phone, leaving the espresso on the table, and walked out into the cold air. She did not cross the street. She simply turned her back and walked toward the subway. By 4 o'clock, she was seated behind her sprawling glass desk on the 42nd floor of Ashford Media Group. The ambient hum of the Manhattan traffic far below was muted by double-pane soundproofing. The door clicked open and Mike Johnson stepped inside. Mike was the agency's lead crisis manager, a man whose loyalty to the Ashford family predated Andrew by a decade. He took one look at Elizabeth's rigid posture, the terrifying stillness in her eyes, and carefully closed the blinds facing the bullpen. "You look like you're attending a funeral, Mike said softly, taking a seat across from her. "I need a favor, Mike. Off the books, off the company servers," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to a measured, sterile frequency. Mike leaned forward, his professional demeanor instantly snapping into place. "Name it." Elizabeth opened a secure file on her laptop, turning the screen toward him. "I need you to quietly untangle every financial thread tying Andrew to this company. The joint accounts, the credit lines under my name, his access to the Ashford Trust. I want a map of his entire monetary existence, and I need to know exactly how to sever it without triggering a single bank alert." Mike's eyes scanned the screen, then flicked up to meet hers. He didn't ask about the suddenness of the request, nor did he offer platitudes. He saw the subtle, defensive way her hand rested near her stomach, and the absolute zero radiating from her expression. "How much time do we have before you pull the pin?" Mike asked quietly. "Not much," Elizabeth replied, looking out at the sprawling, oblivious city. "I'm going to disappear, Mike, and when I do, I want him to realize he has absolutely nothing left." The silence inside the Oakwood Estates house was usually a hallmark of its exclusivity. Tonight, to Andrew Brooks, it felt like a vacuum. He dropped his leather briefcase by the mudroom door, calling out Elizabeth's name. The only response was the faint automated hum of the climate control system. The house was pitch black, save for the solitary glow of the pendant lights above the kitchen island. Andrew walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie, a mild irritation prickling at the back of his neck. She usually left the hallway sconces on if she went to bed early. As he approached the marble counter, his breath caught in his throat. Sitting precisely in the center of the illuminated stone was Elizabeth's iPhone. Beside it lay her platinum wedding band, catching the light with a cold, mocking brilliance. There was no note, no smashed glass, no signs of a struggle. It was a terrifyingly clean absence. Panic, sharp and sudden, pierced through his chest. He took the stairs two at a time, throwing open the doors to the master suite, the guest rooms, the home office. The closets were meticulously organized yet subtly depleted. Her passport was missing along with a single Rimowa suitcase. It was as if she had been carefully erased from the narrative of their life. 50 miles away, in an anonymous high-security corporate penthouse in Tribeca, leased under a ghost LLC, Elizabeth sat bathed in the blue light of her laptop screen. The apartment was sparsely furnished, smelling of fresh paint and industrial cleaner. It was entirely devoid of the warmth she had spent 5 years cultivating in Oakwood. She pulled her cashmere wrap tighter across her shoulders, her hand instinctively coming to rest on her lower abdomen. The nausea had subsided, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. On the screen in front of her, a secure video call with Mike Johnson blinked silently. He was sitting in his own darkened office, the reflection of spreadsheets glowing in his glasses. The physical trail ends at JFK. Mike's voice crackled softly through the speakers. A ticket was booked to Geneva under her maiden name, boarded by a courier I hired who fits her description. By the time Andrew's private investigator untangles the flight manifest, we'll be 2 weeks ahead of him. Elizabeth didn't blink. And the accounts. Ready on your command. She looked down at her bare ring finger. The indentation of the platinum band was still visible, a pale ghost against her skin. She had loved him. She had planned a legacy with him. Now she was looking at a dashboard that connected every artery of his financial existence to the Ashford empire. Do it, Elizabeth whispered into the quiet room. Mike's fingers flew across his keyboard. Executing. The joint checking is frozen. The secondary black Amex under your primary account is canceled. Access to the Ashford equity portfolio is locked pending spousal authorization. The corporate retainer for his consulting firm routed through our subsidiaries is terminated. On her screen, a cascade of green confirmation checks appeared one after another. Back in Oakwood Estates, Andrew stood paralyzed in the center of his expansive closet, clutching Elizabeth's abandoned phone. Suddenly, his own device vibrated violently in his pocket. It was an automated text alert from Chase Private Client, then another from American Express, then an email notification from his wealth management portal. Transaction declined, account suspended, access denied. Elizabeth watched the digital confirmations settle on her screen, the cursor blinking steadily in the dark. She closed the laptop, plunging the Tribeca penthouse into absolute blackness. The trap had been sprung. Now she would watch him starve. The mid-morning light hitting Andrew's mahogany desk in his midtown office felt unusually harsh, exposing a faint cold sheen of sweat on his forehead. 3 days had passed since Elizabeth's ring was left on the granite counter. The initial frantic panic of a missing wife had swiftly morphed into a suffocating public strangulation. He stared at the tablet in his trembling hands. An exclusive blind item on a prominent financial blog had dropped at exactly 8 in the morning, practically handed to the press on a silver platter. It detailed gross ethical ambiguities, leveraged nepotism, and misappropriated funds regarding a certain high-profile consultant tied to a major media empire. It didn't explicitly print the name B. Andrew Brooks, but in the incestuous whispering circles of Manhattan finance, it didn't need to. His desk phone blinked with a steady, relentless red light. His secretary had buzzed in twice in the last hour to announce that 2 of his largest, most conservative clients were terminating their retainers effective immediately. Without the invisible, impenetrable shield of the Ashford family name, he was no longer a brilliant strategist. He was a sudden toxic liability. Across the city in the anonymous Tribeca penthouse, Elizabeth sat wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan, a cup of herbal tea cooling on the table beside her. And she watched the analytics dashboard Mike had set up, tracking the digital footprint of the leaked article. The metrics were climbing exponentially. She rested a hand softly on her lower abdomen, feeling a strange, hollow sense of justice. She was not just erasing herself. She was erasing the power he had stolen from her. Andrew needed an anchor. He left his office, his chest tight with an impending panic attack. He walked right past the line of waiting black cars, forced to descend into the stifling heat of the subway station. His corporate accounts were frozen, his personal cards declined, and his cash reserves were dwindling with terrifying speed. When he finally unlocked the door to the Brooklyn apartment on Montague Street, the space felt entirely different. The charm of the exposed brick and mismatched vintage furniture, which had once felt like a thrilling bohemian escape, from his sterile, perfect life in Oakwood Estates, now just felt cramped and suffocating. Zoe was sitting on the velvet sofa scrolling through her phone, an untouched matcha latte on the coffee table. The vintage Cartier diamond tennis bracelet caught the afternoon sunlight, a mocking, brilliant reminder of the wealth he no longer possessed. "You look terrible," she said, her voice lacking its usual playful, breathless cadence. Her eyes flicked from his disheveled hair to his loosened, crooked tie. Andrew moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of tap water, his hands shaking so badly the glass rattled against his teeth. "My accounts are locked, Elizabeth. She's gone, and she's systematically gutting me." The firm had bleeding the clients by the hour. Zoe slowly lowered her phone, her expression tightening into a mask of cautious calculation. "What do you mean gutting you? What about your personal equity?" "My firm was entirely backed by her family's collateral." He snapped his polished veneer, finally cracking his voice echoing too loudly in the small room. "Without it, I'm over-leveraged. I can't even pay the lease on this apartment next month, Zoe. I have nothing." A profound, heavy silence settled over the room. It was not the comfortable, intimate silence of lovers holding each other against the world. It was the chilling, quiet arithmetic of survival. Zoe looked down at the diamonds on her wrist, tracing the cold stones with her thumb, then back up at Andrew. The man standing before her was no longer the untouchable, affluent savior who bought her expensive dinners and whispered promises of a grand future. He was a drowning man, and he was desperately grasping at her. "Andrew." Zoe began, her tone shifting into something distinctly distant and practical. "I told you when this started that I needed stability. That was the whole point. If you're going under—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The air in the room grew instantly thin. The grand illusion of their passionate, forbidden romance evaporated in the quiet afternoon light, leaving only the ugly transactional skeleton behind. He had traded a loyal wife and a secure empire for a woman who only loved the reflection of his power. And now the mirror was shattered. The glowing skyline of Lower Manhattan usually projected an aura of invincible power, but tonight, viewed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tribeca penthouse, the city just looked cold. Elizabeth stood by the glass, holding a glass of tepid water. The quiet, persistent nausea of her first trimester had settled into a dull, heavy ache in her lower back. She had spent the last 48 hours watching Andrew's professional life burn to ash via proxy servers and encrypted dashboards. It should have felt like a triumph. Instead, it felt like sweeping broken glass into a neat pile, tidy, but still dangerous. The heavy steel door of the apartment clicked and swung inward. Mike Johnson stepped out of the private elevator vestibule carrying a battered, dust-covered cardboard banker's box. His usual immaculate posture was slightly stooped, and the knot of his tie was pulled loose. He did not look like a man who had just successfully executed the final stage of a corporate excommunication. He looked pale. "I thought we agreed to keep everything digital, Mike," Elizabeth said softly, her voice echoing in the sparse room. Mike set the heavy box down on the glass dining table with a dull thud. A faint cloud of archival dust plumed into the air, carrying the sharp, dry scent of decaying paper and old ink. "To legally dissolve the irrevocable trust your mother set up before she died, the one Andrew's firm uses as a collateral shield, I had to pull the original wedding documents." Mike explained, his voice unusually strained. "The physical archives are kept in a climate-controlled vault in New Jersey. I went out there myself this afternoon to bypass the board entirely." Elizabeth walked over to the table, her silk robe whispering against the hardwood floor. "And did you find the dissolution clause?" "I found the clause," Mike said. He didn't look at her. Instead, he reached into the box and pulled out a faded red rope expanding file. The string was frayed, the edges yellowed with age. "But I also found this filed underneath it. It was sealed, instructed to be destroyed upon your mother's passing, but the executor, old man Sterling, had a stroke before he could process the burn orders." Mike opened the flap and extracted a thick stack of bank statements and canceled checks bound by a brittle rubber band. He slid the top 3 checks across the smooth glass surface toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked down. The checks were drawn from a private offshore account managed directly by Eleanor Ashford. The date on the first check was 34 years ago. Her eyes drifted to the payee line. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's sharp, aggressive cursive. that Elizabeth had spent her childhood trying to emulate. Pay to the order of Margaret Brooks. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Elizabeth's breath hitched, a sharp physical pain blooming in her chest. Margaret Brooks, Andrew's mother, a woman who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a Pennsylvania suburb until she passed away a decade ago. Look at the amounts, Elle, Mike whispered. $25,000, $50,000, monthly wire transfers and quarterly cashier's checks. A staggering fortune bleeding out of the Ashford estate month after month, year after year, entirely off the books. Why was my mother paying Andrew's mother? Elizabeth asked, the icy composure she had maintained for days finally fracturing. They didn't even know each other. I introduced Andrew to my family 5 years ago. I don't know, Mike said, his voice grave. But the payments started exactly 8 months before Andrew was born, and they continued without missing a single month until the day Margaret died. Elizabeth stared at the faded blue ink, the carefully constructed narrative of her life, her chance meeting with Andrew at a charity gala, their whirlwind romance, her mother's surprising instant approval of a man from a lower middle-class background, began to twist into something monstrous and unrecognizable. Her hand drifted instinctively to her stomach. The betrayal of the Brooklyn apartment and the Cartier bracelet suddenly felt incredibly small, entirely eclipsed by the suffocating, terrifying shadow of her own lineage. The affair was just a symptom. The disease was something much older, buried deep within the Ashford blood. The rhythmic ticking of the minimalist wall clock in the Tribeca penthouse felt like a hammer against Elizabeth's skull. 72 hours had passed since Mike had deposited the banker's box on her table. 3 days of waiting for a priority off-the-books courier to return from a private genetic testing facility in Switzerland. To secure the sample, Mike had simply accessed the Oakwood Estates home under the guise of retrieving corporate assets, quietly bagging the silver-plated comb Andrew kept in his secondary bathroom drawer. Elizabeth had provided her own swab. Now the encrypted email sat unread in her inbox. The subject line was a sterile string of meaningless alphanumeric characters. Elizabeth sat at the glass dining table staring at the glowing screen. The city beyond the windows was shrouded in a thick, suffocating fog, rendering the usually dazzling Manhattan skyline into a wall of oppressive gray. She pressed her palms flat against the cold surface of the table, attempting to ground herself. Her breath was incredibly shallow. The nausea, an ever-present companion of her first trimester, surged violently in her throat, mingling with a profound existential dread. She clicked the trackpad. The PDF password prompt appeared. She typed in the randomly generated key Mike had provided. The document loaded instantly. It was stark, devoid of letterhead to protect the client's anonymity, just clinical columns of genetic markers, locus points, alleles, statistical probabilities. Elizabeth's eyes bypassed the dense medical jargon, dropping directly to the summarized conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of half-sibling relationship 99. 98% conclusion. The tested subjects share a single biological parent. The air completely vanished from the room. A high-pitched, ringing, shrill and deafening erupted in Elizabeth's ears. She stared at the black text until the letters began to bleed into the harsh white background. The pieces of the grotesque puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. The offshore payments. Her father, the revered, fiercely charismatic founder of Ashford Media, and Margaret Brooks, a quiet woman in a Pennsylvania suburb. Her mother's desperate lifelong campaign to buy Margaret's silence, funneling a fortune, to hide the illegitimate son who could shatter the pristine Ashford legacy and their social standing. And then decades later, that same son had walked into a Manhattan charity gala and charmed the legitimate daughter. Her mother had passed away 2 years before Elizabeth met Andrew. There had been no one left to stop the collision. No one to recognize the quiet, horrifying irony when Elizabeth brought him home to the estate, unknowingly marrying her own brother. Elizabeth pushed her chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She stumbled toward the bathroom, her knees buckling, the moment she reached the porcelain sink. She gripped the cold edges, her knuckles turning bone white, and retched violently into the basin, though there was nothing left in her stomach. When she finally lifted her heavy head, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her skin was ashen, her eyes hollow, entirely stripped of the fierce, untouchable executive she had been just a week ago. Her trembling hand moved down, resting flat against her lower abdomen. The child, The secret she had been harboring, the fragile life she had briefly, desperately thought she could protect and raise on her own terms, was fundamentally tainted. It was a product of a generational sin, a biological catastrophe conceived in a bed of incest. The betrayal of Andrew's affair with Zoe in the Brooklyn apartment was suddenly reduced to a petty, insignificant footnote. Elizabeth slid down the cold, tiled wall, pulling her knees tightly to her chest as a tearless, suffocating sob racked her body. She was completely devastatingly alone, trapped in a nightmare authored by her own bloodline. The calculated revenge she had plotted against her cheating husband was utterly meaningless now because the man she was systematically destroying was her own flesh and blood. The wrought iron gates of Oakwood Estates parted silently, allowing the black town car to slip through the heavy autumn mist. Elizabeth stepped out onto the damp driveway, pulling her dark cashmere coat tightly around her frail frame. The house stood before her, a sprawling dark monument to a life that had never truly belonged to her. Inside, the air was stale, smelling faintly of dust and despair. The power had been severely restricted by the frozen accounts, leaving only the pale security lights casting long skeletal shadows across the hardwood floors. She found Andrew in the living room. He was sitting on the edge of the oversized linen sofa, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace. The immaculate, charismatic financial consultant was completely gone. His face was covered in a rough, uneven shadow of a beard, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, the collar of his dress shirt wrinkled and stained. At the sound of her footsteps, he slowly looked up. A pathetic flicker of hope mixed with deep, exhausted shame crossed his face. "Elizabeth," he rasped, his voice cracking in the cavernous room. He stood up, taking a hesitant step forward. "You came back. Please. I know what you did to the firm. To the accounts. I deserve it. Zoe is gone. Everyone is gone. I have absolutely nothing left. Please, just tell me how to fix this." Elizabeth looked at the man she had loved, the man whose child she was secretly carrying, the man who had betrayed her in a Brooklyn apartment. But the fierce, righteous fury she had cultivated over the past 2 weeks was entirely absent. In its place was a profound, suffocating sorrow. She did not step back as he approached. She simply raised her hand, a gesture so cold and absolute that it anchored him instantly to the floorboards. "This isn't about Zoe," Elizabeth said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed with a terrifying finality. "This was never about Zoe, Andrew." She moved past him to the grand mahogany coffee table, unzipping her leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder and dropped it onto the glass surface. The heavy slap of the paper resonated through the silent house. "Open it," she commanded, her eyes hollow, deadened to the world. Andrew hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the folder. He flipped it open. On top was the brittle, yellowed ledger and the copies of the cashier's checks. He frowned, his bleary eyes scanning the faded ink. "What is this?" he muttered, tracing a finger over the payee line. "Margaret Brooks, my mother. Why does your mother's estate have checks made out to—" "Keep reading," Elizabeth cut in, the ambient temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees. Andrew turned the page. Beneath the financial records lay the stark white printout from the Swiss Genetic Laboratory. He read the clinical headers, the locus points, and finally the highlighted conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of half-sibling relationship, 99.98%. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was absolutely silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked each second, heavy and unforgiving. Andrew's eyes darted wildly from the paper to Elizabeth, then back to the paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. The pieces were connecting in real time behind his panicked eyes: the absent father he never knew, his mother's sudden influx of quiet wealth, the miraculous ease with which he had been accepted into the Ashford empire. "No," he choked out, stumbling backward. The folder slipped from his grasp, the papers scattering across the expensive Persian rug. "No, that's a lie. You fabricated this to ruin me. You faked it." Elizabeth stood perfectly still, single tear finally breaking free and tracking silently down her pale cheek. "I wish I had. My mother paid yours to hide you, to protect the Ashford name. And then you walked into my life, and she was already dead. Nobody was left to stop us." Andrew fell to his knees. His hands tore at his own hair as a guttural, wretched sound tore from his throat, a sound of a mind fundamentally and irrevocably breaking. The financial ruin, the public humiliation, the loss of his mistress, none of it mattered anymore. He was weeping on the floor of the house he had shared with his sister, mourning a marriage that was an abomination from the very first kiss. Elizabeth turned away, leaving him to drown in the horrifying truth, and walked out into the cold, dark night. The rhythmic, barely audible hum of the air purifier was the only sound in the private recovery suite of the discreet Upper East Side clinic. Elizabeth lay perfectly still beneath the crisp white cotton sheets. The physical procedure had been brief, administered by a doctor bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements and generations of Ashford loyalty. The emotional severing, however, left a hollow, echoing cavern within her that she knew would never truly close. She turned her head slowly to the window, watching the gray Manhattan sky weep rain against the reinforced glass. The child, the impossible, tragic anomaly born of a lie, was gone. Mike Johnson sat in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel in a tailored charcoal suit. He did not offer empty sympathies. Instead, he simply stood and placed a sleek leather portfolio on the bedside tray. Inside were the final annulment papers. The grounds were listed under vaguely worded, legally impenetrable terms of irreconcilable fraud, instantly sealed by a judge on the Ashford payroll. Andrew had not contested a single clause. Following the revelation in the Oakwood house, his mind had simply fractured. Mike had quietly arranged for his admission into an exclusive, highly secured psychiatric facility in Connecticut, funded entirely by a blind trust. Andrew Brooks, the charismatic financial consultant, had ceased to exist. In his place was a broken ghost, haunted by a truth he could neither accept nor escape. Elizabeth picked up the heavy Montblanc pen. Her hand did not tremble as she signed her maiden name, the sharp, aggressive cursive eerily mirroring her late mother's. With a few strokes of black ink, the marriage was erased. The cheating husband, the Brooklyn mistress, the staggering betrayal, it was all surgically removed from her public narrative, buried beneath the impenetrable weight of the Ashford fortune. 3 days later, the autumn wind whipped through the sprawling ancient oaks of Woodlawn Cemetery. The air was sharp, carrying the bitter scent of decaying leaves and impending winter. Elizabeth walked alone down the gravel path, her black wool coat buttoned to the collar. She bypassed the modest headstones, making her way toward the highest elevation of the grounds, where the imposing marble architecture of the Ashford family mausoleum stood like a fortress against time. She stopped at the wrought iron gates of the monument. Carved into the flawless white stone were the names of her lineage: Arthur Ashford, Eleanor Ashford, the architects of an empire and the silent authors of a catastrophic tragedy. Her mother had bought silence with millions, and her father had seeded a disaster that had ultimately cost Elizabeth her innocence, her marriage, and her unborn child. In her gloved hands, she held a simple bouquet of white calla lilies. They were elegant, pristine, and entirely devoid of warmth, a perfect reflection of the legacy she now commanded alone. Elizabeth stepped forward, placing the flowers gently on the cold, polished granite step. She did not cry. She had no tears left to shed for the man who had lied to her in a Brooklyn apartment, nor for the parents who had lied to her from the moment she was born. She simply stood in the freezing wind, acknowledging the chilling cost of the power she wielded. She had taken everything from the man who wronged her, only to discover that her own bloodline had already taken everything from them both. Elizabeth pulled her collar up against the cold, turned her back on the marble tomb, and began the long, quiet walk back to the city of the living.